Sometimes the people we underestimate carry the deepest wisdom. Sometimes a simple moment can humble a man and change his heart forever. In Cedar Gulch, Boaz McClain was used to being the biggest and smartest cowboy around. Standing 6'6" with a preacher uncle's education, he liked dropping Latin phrases to impress the local women. When he saw June Delaney in her simple dress mending fence, he figured she was just another ranch girl. So he walked over with his usual swagger and spoke to her in Latin, expecting her to giggle and look impressed. Instead, June looked up with steady brown eyes and answered him back in perfect Latin. Then she tipped her hat and walked away, leaving the biggest man in 3 counties standing speechless in the dust. Who was this quiet cowgirl who could speak like a scholar, and how would her secret past change everything Bo thought he knew about love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust hadn't settled from that encounter 3 days past, but Boaz McClain couldn't shake the memory of those steady brown eyes. He sat now on the porch of his modest ranch house, watching the sun paint the Cedar Gulch Valley in shades of amber and gold. In his weathered hands, he held his most precious possession, his Uncle Jeremiah's Latin Bible, its leather binding cracked from years of careful study and contemplation. The book had been his constant companion since arriving in Cedar Gulch 5 years ago, a reminder of those formative years spent in his uncle's study back in Philadelphia. Uncle Jeremiah had been a learned man, a preacher with a scholar's heart who had taken in his orphaned nephew and filled his head with classical education alongside scripture. Latin, Greek, philosophy, literature, all of it had seemed so important then, so meaningful in those quiet rooms filled with books and learning. Now, holding the Bible in the fading light, Bo felt smaller than he had in years. Not physically, Lord, knew he'd never been small a day in his life, standing as he did like a mountain among the rolling hills of humanity. But inside, where it mattered, he felt reduced to something humble and uncertain. Cedar Gulch stretched out before him like a painting come to life. The town had grown up around the cattle trade, a collection of weathered buildings and honest folks making their way in a hard but beautiful land. The main street ran straight as an arrow between the Copper Dollar Saloon and Henderson's General Store, with the sheriff's office, Doc Henley's practice, and a handful of other businesses filling out the spaces between. Beyond the town proper, ranches dotted the landscape like islands in an ocean of prairie grass, each one carved out by families who'd come west, seeking something better. Bo had found his something better here, or so he'd thought. After Uncle Jeremiah's passing, Philadelphia had felt too small for a man of his size and too refined for his restless spirit. The West had called to him with promises of open spaces and honest work. He'd bought his small spread with the money his uncle left him, built it up with his own hands, and made a place for himself among the good people of Cedar Gulch. The townspeople had taken to him quickly enough. His size made him useful for the heavy work that needed doing, raising barn beams, moving stubborn cattle, settling the occasional dispute that required more presence than violence. His education made him something of a curiosity, the gentle giant who could quote Shakespeare while shoeing a horse, or discuss philosophy while branding calves. And his nature, generous and given to harmless mischief, had endeared him to most everyone. Martha Calloway, who ran the Copper Dollar with her late husband's steady hand and her own sharp wit, often said Bo was like a big friendly dog who'd learned to walk on 2 legs and speak fancy words. The comparison never offended him. Martha meant it with affection, and there was truth in it. He did enjoy making people smile, enjoyed the surprise that crossed their faces when he'd drop a line of Latin or quote Cicero while helping them load supplies. But 3 days ago, that harmless vanity had been exposed for what it truly was, showing off, pure and simple. The memory of it made his cheeks burn with embarrassment. He'd been riding back from the north pasture when he spotted her mending fence along the Delaney property line. June Delaney, the quiet one who kept to herself and worked her small ranch with a determination that impressed even the hardest men in the valley. She'd been bent over a section of wire that had come loose, her simple brown dress practical and modest, her wide-brimmed hat shading her face from the afternoon sun. Something about the sight had stirred him, not just her gentle beauty, though that was undeniable, but the capable way she handled the tools, the patient focus she brought to her work. In that moment, she'd seemed to embody everything he found appealing about this country: strength without show, beauty without vanity, competence wedded to grace. So naturally, he'd decided to impress her. The Latin phrase he'd chosen had been deliberately flirtatious, something Uncle Jeremiah would have boxed his ears for using. Pulchra es sicut luna, stellis coronata. You are beautiful as the moon, crowned with stars. He delivered it with his most charming smile, fully expecting her to blush and giggle and maybe allow him to help with her fence. Instead, she'd straightened slowly, fixed him with those remarkable brown eyes, and replied without hesitation, "Et tu, magnus vir, stultus es sicut asinus qui se sapientem putat," and you, big man, are foolish as a donkey who thinks himself wise. Then she'd tipped her hat with perfect politeness and walked away, leaving him sitting his horse like a statue of stunned confusion. The worst part wasn't the insult, though it had been delivered with surgical precision. The worst part was the dawning realization that he'd approached her with the same casual condescension he might show to any simple ranch girl, and she'd seen right through him. Since that day, he'd found himself watching for her around town with a mixture of curiosity and something approaching awe. June Delaney moved through Cedar Gulch like a woman with secrets, polite to everyone but intimate with no one. She conducted her business with quiet efficiency, spoke when spoken to with perfect courtesy, and revealed nothing of herself beyond what was necessary for daily interaction. Martha had tried to satisfy his curiosity over drinks at the Copper Dollar the evening after his encounter. "June keeps to herself," she'd said, polishing a glass with more attention than it required. "Been here about 2 years now, works that little ranch harder than most men work theirs, pays her bills, minds her own business, doesn't cause trouble." "Where'd she come from?" Bo had asked, trying to sound casual. "East somewhere, never said exactly where, and nobody's pressed her on it. Woman's got a right to her privacy, especially if she's running from something painful." Martha had given him a look that suggested he'd better respect that privacy. Sheriff Tom Rawlings had been even less forthcoming when Bo had tried a casual inquiry the next day. "June Delaney's a good citizen," Tom had said with the finality of a man who wouldn't be drawn into gossip. "Works hard, stays out of trouble, treats folks fair. That's all that matters to me." Doc Henley had simply smiled and changed the subject when Bo had wondered aloud about June's background during a chance encounter outside the general store. It was as if the entire town had conspired to protect her privacy, and Bo was beginning to understand why. There was something fragile about June Delaney, despite her obvious strength, something that suggested she'd been hurt and was still healing. The way she held herself apart wasn't unfriendliness, it was caution, the wariness of someone who'd learned that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Now, as the sun settled toward the horizon and painted the sky in shades of rose and purple, Bo found himself thinking not about his wounded pride, but about the woman who'd so thoroughly deflated it. Her Latin had been flawless, her pronunciation better than his own. More than that, her choice of words had been clever, cutting without being cruel, a perfect blend of wit and reproof. Who was June Delaney? And how had a woman with such obvious education and refinement ended up working a hard-scrabble ranch in the middle of nowhere? The questions nagged at him as he rose from his chair and headed inside to prepare his simple supper. Whatever her story, one thing was clear: if he wanted to know June Delaney, he'd have to approach her as an equal, not as a cowboy, trying to impress a simple ranch girl with fancy words. For the first time in years, Boaz McClain felt the stirring of a genuine challenge, and despite his embarrassment, he found himself looking forward to it. Market Day in Cedar Gulch brought the scattered ranch families together in a celebration of commerce and community. The third Saturday of each month, the main street transformed into a bustling bazaar where folks traded goods, shared news, and caught up on the social fabric that held their small world together. Bo had loaded his wagon with excess vegetables from his garden and a few calves he was ready to sell. The morning air carried the mingled scents of fresh bread, leather goods, and the earthy smell of livestock. Children darted between the stalls while their parents conducted business with the measured pace of people who had learned that good deals required patience and conversation in equal measure. He was haggling good-naturedly with Pete Morrison over the price of his calves when he spotted June across the crowded street. She stood beside her own modest wagon, selling eggs and vegetables with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. Her brown dress was clean and well-mended, her hat pulled low against the morning sun, and her manner courteous but reserved as she conducted her transactions. Bo found himself watching her with the fascination of a man trying to solve a puzzle. 3 weeks had passed since their encounter at the fence line, and he'd seen her around town several times since then. Each time, he'd been struck anew by the contradiction she presented, a woman who looked like any hard-working ranch wife, but spoke Latin like a university professor. "Earth to Bo McClain," Pete Morrison said with amusement. "You planning to buy these calves back from me, or are you just going to stand there mooning over the Delaney girl?" Bo felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Just keeping an eye on the neighborhood, Pete, making sure everyone's conducting themselves proper." Pete followed his gaze and chuckled. "That one's got you twisted up tighter than barbed wire, doesn't she? Can't say I blame you. June's a fine-looking woman, and smart as a whip from what I hear." "What do you hear?" Bo asked, trying to keep the eagerness out of his voice. "Not much that makes sense. Martha Calloway says she's educated, but Doc Henley thinks she might be running from trouble back east. Sheriff Rawlings won't say nothing either way, but he watches her like he's protecting something valuable." Pete shrugged. "All I know for certain is she pays her bills and minds her own business. That's enough for most folks." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near June's wagon. A small object had fallen from her saddlebags as she reached for something, and it rolled across the dusty ground toward Bo's feet. Without thinking, he bent to retrieve it, his large hand closing around a small, tarnished bronze medal. The medal was attached to a faded ribbon, and as Bo turned it over in his palm, he could make out the engraved words, "Harvard University, Excellence in Classical Studies, William J. Delaney, 1847. The breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any academic medal, it was a Harvard medal, and the name on it wasn't June's. "Excuse me." June's voice was carefully controlled, but Bo could hear the tension beneath the politeness. She had approached while he was examining the medal, and now stood before him with her hand extended. "I believe that belongs to me." Bo looked up into those steady brown eyes and saw something he'd never noticed before, fear. Not of him, but of what he might do with the knowledge the medal represented. "William J. Delaney," he said softly, making no move to return the medal yet. "Your father." June's composure wavered for just a moment, like a mask slipping before being carefully adjusted back into place. "Yes. May I have it back, please?" Instead of handing it over immediately, Bo studied her face with new understanding. "Harvard, Classical Studies. That explains the Latin." "Instead, Mr. McClain." June's voice carried a note of warning now. "That medal is all I have left of my father. I would appreciate having it returned." Bo held out the medal, but when June reached for it, he closed his fingers gently around her hand. "I'm not going to tell anyone, if that's what you're worried about, but I'd like to know the story, if you're willing to share it." June looked down at their joined hands, then back up to his face. For a long moment, she studied him, as if trying to determine whether he could be trusted. Finally, she sighed and slipped the medal into her pocket. "There's not much to tell. My father was Professor William Delaney. He taught classical languages and literature at Harvard University for 23 years. I was his only child, and after my mother died when I was 12, he educated me himself. I could read Latin and Greek before I could properly braid my hair. What happened to him? He died 3 years ago. Consumption. June's voice remained steady, but Bo could see the pain the memory still caused her. When he died, I discovered that he'd been living beyond his means for years, trying to maintain the lifestyle he thought his position required. There were debts I couldn't pay, creditors who wanted everything we owned. So you came west. I came west with what I could carry and enough money to buy a small piece of land where no one would ask questions about my past. June's chin lifted slightly, defiance creeping into her tone. I've made an honest life for myself here, Mr. McClain. I work hard, I pay my bills, and I don't cause trouble for anyone. I didn't mean to imply that you did. Bo found himself speaking more gently than usual, moved by the quiet dignity with which she'd shared her story. I'm just trying to understand why a woman with your education is working a ranch instead of teaching school somewhere. 12. June's laugh held no humor. You think any school board would hire a woman with no references, no connections, and no family to vouch for her character? You think they'd believe that a woman alone had come by a Harvard education? Honestly. She shook her head. I tried that route, Mr. McClain. The world doesn't make room for women like me. The bitterness in her voice struck Bo like a physical blow. Here was a woman with an education that surpassed his own, reduced to hiding her intelligence and working with her hands because society had no place for a learned woman without proper credentials or family connections. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. I didn't realize. Of course you didn't. June's voice softened slightly. You're a man, Mr. McClain. The world makes room for men with education, even out here. You can quote Latin and Shakespeare and people think it's charming. When I do it, they think I'm putting on airs or lying about who I am. Bo thought about all the times he'd casually displayed his learning, expecting admiration and getting it. The privilege he'd taken for granted suddenly felt like a weight on his conscience. The day at the fence, he said slowly, when I spoke to you in Latin, you were showing off. June finished matter-of-factly, testing the simple ranch girl to see if she'd be impressed by your fancy education. It's not the first time someone's done that to me, Mr. McClain. It probably won't be the last. I'm sorry, Bo said again, and this time he put all the sincerity he could muster into the words. You're right. I was showing off, and I was condescending, and you had every right to put me in my place. June studied his face for a long moment. Most men would be angry about being made to look foolish in public. Most men probably deserved it less than I did. Bo managed a rueful smile. I've been thinking about what you said for 3 weeks now. Stultus assicuta sinus quis sapientem puta. Foolish as a donkey who thinks himself wise. It was perfectly chosen, cutting enough to make your point, but not so harsh as to be truly cruel. And something shifted in June's expression, a wall coming down just slightly. You've been thinking about it for 3 weeks? Among other things, Bo found himself speaking more honestly than he'd intended. I've been thinking about you, Miss Delaney. About the mystery you represent and the intelligence you hide, and the fact that you're the first woman I've met who could match me, quote for quote, from Cicero or Virgil. June's cheeks colored slightly. Flattery, Mr. McClain? Truth, Miss Delaney, and an apology for approaching you like you were just another pretty face to charm with fancy words. Bo took a deep breath. If you'd be willing, I'd like to start over. Not as the show-off cowboy and the simple ranch girl, but as two people who might find they have more in common than either of them expected. June was quiet for so long that Bo began to think he'd overstepped again. Finally, she nodded once. A small gesture, but somehow significant. I suppose we might try that, Mr. McClain, though I should warn you I don't suffer fools gladly, Latin-speaking or otherwise. Bo's smile was genuine this time. I wouldn't expect anything less, Miss Delaney. I wouldn't expect anything less. 2 days after market day, Bo found himself standing on June's front porch with a wooden chess set tucked under his arm and his heart beating like a schoolboy's. The modest ranch house looked smaller in the afternoon light, but it was neat and well-maintained, with a vegetable garden that spoke of careful tending and practical knowledge. When June opened the door, she looked surprised to see him. She'd traded her market-day dress for working clothes, a simple skirt and blouse that had seen better days, but were clean and mended with precise stitches. "Mr. McClain," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "this is unexpected. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, Miss Delaney." Bo held up the chess set with what he hoped was a disarming smile. "I brought you a proposition." June's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, you said we might try starting over as two people with more in common than expected. I thought perhaps we might discover just how much common ground we share." He indicated the chess set. "This belonged to my Uncle Jeremiah. He taught me that the best conversations happen over a good game of chess." June stared at the chess set for a long moment, and Bo could almost see her mind working, weighing options and considering possibilities. Finally, she stepped back from the door. "I suppose you'd better come in then." June's sitting room was modest but comfortable, furnished with pieces that had clearly been chosen for practicality rather than fashion. What struck Bo immediately were the books, not many, but carefully selected volumes that lined a small shelf near the window. He could make out titles by Shakespeare, Dickens, and several works in Latin that made his pulse quicken with excitement. "You kept some of your father's library," he observed as June cleared a small table by the window. "What I could carry," she replied simply. "Books were always more precious than furniture in our house." Bo set up the chess pieces with practiced efficiency, noting that June watched his movements with the keen attention of someone who understood the game. When he'd finished, he gestured to the chair across from him. "White or black, Miss Delaney?" "White," she said without hesitation. "I prefer to make the first move." Her opening was classical and precise pawn to King 4, developing her center control with textbook perfection. Bo responded in kind, and within a few moves, it became clear that June knew what she was doing. "Your father taught you to play?" he asked as she moved her knight to attack his bishop. "Among other things." June's voice carried a note of wry amusement. "He believed that chess developed the same mental discipline required for classical studies. Logic, strategy, the ability to think several moves ahead." Bo moved his bishop to safety and found himself genuinely impressed by her tactical awareness. "He sounds like a wise man." He was. June captured one of his pawns with elegant efficiency, though perhaps not wise enough in practical matters. A professor's salary doesn't stretch as far as academic idealism would suggest. There was sadness in her voice, but no bitterness now. Bo sensed that she was testing him, sharing pieces of her story to see how he would respond. "Uncle Jeremiah had similar blind spots," he offered, developing his pieces with more care than he'd shown in their opening moves. He could quote Aristotle by the hour, but he never learned to balance his accounts properly. "After he died, I discovered he'd been giving away money to anyone with a sad story and a plausible need. Generosity can be its own kind of folly," June agreed, then surprised him by offering a slight smile. "Though I suppose there are worse faults than caring too much for others." They played in comfortable concentration for several moves, each testing the other's skill and finding themselves evenly matched. Bo realized with growing excitement that June wasn't just a competent player, she was genuinely good, with an intuitive grasp of position and timing that suggested years of serious study. "Check," she said quietly, moving her queen into position with surgical precision. Bo studied the board and felt his admiration deepen. The attack had been building for several moves, so subtly developed that he'd walked into it without seeing the trap until it was too late. "Beautifully played," he said, moving his king to safety. "You've been planning that sequence since move 12. Move 10, actually." June's eyes held a glint of satisfaction. "You left your kingside slightly weak when you advanced your pawns. I simply waited for the right moment to exploit it." Bo found himself laughing with genuine delight. I haven't been outplayed that elegantly since Uncle Jeremiah was alive. He'd have appreciated your style, patient, precise, and just ruthless enough to be effective. Your uncle sounds like he was important to you. He was everything to me after my parents died. Bo moved carefully, trying to consolidate his position while June maintained her advantage. My father was a good man, but not an educated one. He died when I was 14, kicked by a horse he was trying to break. My mother followed him 6 months later. I think she just couldn't bear to live without him. June's expression softened. I'm sorry. That must have been terribly difficult. Uncle Jeremiah took me in without question, gave me an education I never could have gotten otherwise, taught me to think and read and question the world around me. Bo paused, studying the board but really thinking about the past. He used to say that education was the one inheritance that could never be stolen or lost. I didn't understand what he meant until I came west and realized how much my learning set me apart from other men. And now I'm beginning to understand that education without wisdom is just showing off. And that real intelligence includes knowing when to keep your mouth shut and when to listen. Bo met her eyes across the chessboard. I've been doing too much of the former and not enough of the latter. June moved her rook with quiet efficiency, tightening her position. Wisdom usually comes from experience, Mr. McClain. Often painful experience. Is that what brought you west? Painful experience? June was quiet for a long moment, considering both the chessboard and his question. My father's death taught me that the life I'd always known could disappear overnight. The creditors and lawyers who came afterward taught me that a woman alone has very few options, especially when she has no family connections or independent means. But you survived. I survived. June's voice carried a note of quiet pride. I learned to work with my hands, to live simply, to find contentment in small things. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it became a life I could respect. Bo found himself moved by her quiet strength. Here was a woman who had lost everything that defined her identity and had rebuilt herself from scratch, asking nothing from anyone and making her own way through sheer determination. Check, he said, having found a tactical shot that at least gave him some counterplay. June smiled and moved her king, easily avoiding the threat. Better, but not quite good enough. They continued playing as the afternoon light shifted through the window, their conversation flowing as smoothly as their moves across the board. Bo found himself sharing stories of his early days in Cedar Gulch, the loneliness of building a ranch from scratch, and the satisfaction of earning acceptance in a community that valued actions over words. June, in turn, spoke of the challenge of learning ranch work, the kindness of neighbors who had helped her without asking too many questions, and the strange peace she'd found in physical labor after a lifetime spent in books and study. Checkmate, she said finally, her voice gentle but satisfied. Bo studied the board and nodded in recognition of her victory. She'd played with masterful patience, slowly improving her position, while he'd focused too much on tactics and not enough on strategy. Thoroughly outplayed, he admitted with genuine respect. Would you be willing to give me a chance to redeem myself? Perhaps, June said, beginning to reset the pieces. Though I should warn you, my father always said I was a quick study and a slow forgiver when it came to chess. Bo laughed as he helped her arrange the board for another game. Fair warning noted. Miss Delaney, fair warning noted. As they began their second game, Bo found himself thinking that this was exactly what he'd hoped for, not the shallow flirtation he might have attempted with another woman, but a genuine meeting of minds, a chance to know June Delaney as the intelligent, complex person she truly was. And if the way she smiled when she captured his knight was any indication, she might be enjoying the process as much as he was. The storm rolled in from the west like God's own judgment, transforming the peaceful afternoon into a symphony of thunder and lightning that sent every sensible person scurrying for shelter. Bo had been riding back from checking his northern fence line when the first fat raindrops began to fall, and he'd guided his horse toward the old Hartwell barn that sat abandoned on the property line between his land and June's. He'd just gotten his horse settled in the relative safety of the barn when he heard another rider approaching through the driving rain. To his surprise and concern, June appeared in the doorway, leading her mare and looking thoroughly soaked despite her oilskin coat. "Miss Delaney," he called out, moving to help her with her horse. "You picked a fine day for a ride." "I was checking the creek," she said, accepting his assistance with the mare. "Sometimes heavy rains wash out the crossing, and I wanted to make sure it was still passable." She pushed a strand of wet hair back from her face and looked around the barn with practical assessment. "Looks like we'll be here for a while." The barn was sturdy despite its abandonment, with enough roof left intact to keep them dry and plenty of old hay bales to provide makeshift seating. Bo settled his horse next to June's and then turned to survey their temporary shelter. "Could be worse accommodations," he observed. "At least it's dry." June had removed her wet coat and was wringing water from her hair. In the dim light filtering through the barn's gaps, she looked younger somehow, more vulnerable than the composed woman he'd come to know. When she moved to sit on one of the hay bales, something fell from her coat pocket, a small leather-bound book that landed open on the barn floor. Bo moved instinctively to retrieve it, but stopped when he saw what it was. The pages were covered in June's careful handwriting, and even upside down he could see that it wasn't a ledger or account book. The words visible on the open page were arranged in verse, with the kind of careful attention to rhythm and meter that spoke of poetry. June had frozen when she saw what had fallen, her face coloring with embarrassment. For a moment, neither of them moved. "I'm sorry," Bo said quietly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "It's nothing important," June said quickly, reaching for the book. But Bo was closer, and as he bent to pick it up, his eyes caught on a few lines that made him pause. "The morning brings no comfort to the exile's heart, though sunrise paints the prairie gold with hope. What solace can the stranger's dawn impart? When memories of home are all the scope." "Miss Delaney," he said softly, "this is beautiful." June's hand stilled on the book. "You shouldn't read that, it's private." "Of course it is. I apologize." Bo closed the book gently and held it out to her. "But from what I glimpsed, you have real talent. The meter is perfect, and the imagery—" He shook his head. "You're a poet as well as a scholar." June took the book and clutched it to her chest, her expression a mixture of pride and vulnerability. "It's just something I do, a way to work through thoughts and feelings. My father encouraged it when I was younger." "Did he write as well?" "Some. Mostly academic papers and the occasional sermon when he was asked to guest preach." June settled back on the hay bale, the book still held protectively in her hands. "He always said that poetry was the highest form of language, that it required not just intelligence, but wisdom and feeling working in harmony." Bo found himself genuinely curious. "May I ask what you write about?" June hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "The West, mostly. The landscape, the people, the contrast between my old life and my new one." She paused. "Loss, memory. The strange ways that heartbreak can transform into something like peace, given enough time." The honesty in her voice struck Bo deeply. Here was another layer to June Delaney, another facet of the complex woman who had captured his imagination so completely. "Would you," he began, then stopped. "I'm sorry. I have no right to ask." "What were you going to ask? Would you share something with me? I promise I won't judge or criticize. I'm just genuinely interested in how you see the world." June studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his interest was genuine or merely polite. The rain continued to drum on the barn roof, creating an intimate cocoon of sound around them. Finally, she opened the book and flipped through several pages. "This one," she said quietly. "I wrote it last month, after a particularly difficult day." She cleared her throat and began to read. "The scholar's daughter tends her garden now. Her hands, once soft with books and learning's grace, grown strong with honest labor's sacred vow, to build anew in this forgotten place. The Latin phrases that once filled her days now mingle with the meadowlark's sweet song, while sunset paints the prairie gold with praise. For all the ways that endings can be strong, she does not mourn the life that might have been, the halls of learning, and the world she knew. For in this land where only truth has been, her guide and companion, she has found it too. That wisdom comes not just from ancient books, but from the peace that lives in morning's looks. When she finished, the barn fell silent except for the sound of rain and their own quiet breathing. Bo felt something profound shift in his chest, a recognition that went beyond admiration or attraction. This woman had not just survived the loss of her former life, she had transformed it into something beautiful. "June," he said softly, using her first name without thinking. "That's extraordinary. The way you've captured not just the experience but the meaning of it." He shook his head. "I've never heard anything more honest or more moving." June looked up from the book, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. "You really think so?" "I know so." Bo moved closer, settling on an adjacent hay bale so he could see her face more clearly. "You have a gift, June. A real gift for capturing truth in language. It's just personal scribbling, nothing that would interest anyone else." "That's where you're wrong." Bo's voice carried conviction. "The most personal truths are often the most universal ones. What you just read about loss and rebuilding and finding wisdom in unexpected places that speaks to anyone who's ever had to start over." June wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that was somehow both vulnerable and dignified. "I've never shared my writing with anyone before, not since my father died. I'm honored that you shared it with me." Bo paused, then decided to risk honesty. "I've been thinking a lot lately about the difference between intelligence and wisdom. You have both, June, but more than that, you have the courage to be honest about what you've learned. That's rarer than all the classical education in the world." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside their shelter. Finally, June spoke again. "What about you, Bo? What drives you to keep learning, to keep growing out here where most men would be content with cattle and weather talk?" Bo considered the question carefully. "Uncle Jeremiah used to say that the mind was like a muscle. It either grew stronger with use or weaker with neglect. I suppose I've always been afraid of becoming smaller than I was meant to be." He paused. "But lately, I've been wondering if I've been using my education to set myself apart rather than to connect with others. Your poetry, it connects. It builds bridges instead of walls. Perhaps that's the difference between showing off and sharing truth," June observed. "Perhaps it is." Bo found himself studying her face in the dim light, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the strength in the set of her jaw. "June, may I ask you something personal?" "You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer. Do you ever regret coming west? Do you ever wish you could go back to the academic world you knew?" June was quiet for a long time, staring out at the rain through a gap in the barn wall. "Sometimes," she said finally. "I miss the conversations, the sense of being part of something larger than daily survival. I miss having my intelligence taken for granted, instead of having to hide it or apologize for it." "You don't have to hide it from me." June turned to look at him, and something passed between them in the dim barn, an understanding, perhaps, or a recognition of kindred spirits. "No," she said softly. "I don't, do I?" The storm was beginning to pass, the thunder growing more distant, and the rain settling into a steady but lighter rhythm. Soon they would have to leave their shelter and return to their separate lives. But for now, in this moment, Bo felt they had crossed some invisible threshold into deeper territory. "When this rain stops," he said carefully, "would you mind if I called on you again? Properly, I mean, not just by accident or chance encounter." June smiled, and it was the first completely unguarded smile he'd seen from her. "I think I'd like that, Bo. I think I'd like that very much." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered by the regular mail rider who made his circuit through the outlying ranches once a week. June had been hanging laundry on the line behind her house when she heard the approaching hoofbeats, and she'd walked around to the front porch with wet hands and a light heart, expecting perhaps correspondence from one of the few suppliers who did business with her ranch. Instead, the mail rider handed her an envelope that made her blood run cold. The return address was written in elegant script: Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, 47 Beacon Hill, Boston, Massachusetts. Her father's sister, the aunt who had written exactly once since June's flight from Boston, a brief, cold note expressing disapproval of June's decision to disappear into the wilderness like a common refugee. June thanked the mail rider with hands that barely trembled and waited until he'd ridden away before tearing open the envelope. The letter inside was written on expensive stationery in Aunt Margaret's precise handwriting. My dear June, I trust this letter finds you in good health, despite the circumstances of your self-imposed exile. I write to inform you that the Whitmore Academy for Young Ladies here in Boston is in need of a qualified instructor in classical languages and literature. The position offers a generous salary, comfortable lodgings on the academy grounds, and the opportunity to return to civilized society where your education might be properly valued. I have taken the liberty of speaking to the headmistress about your qualifications, while your unconventional circumstances present certain difficulties. My standing in Boston society carries enough weight to overcome any concerns about your recent adventures in the frontier. The position begins with the winter term in January. I require your answer by the end of October, as other arrangements must be made if you decline this generous opportunity. I trust you will see the wisdom in accepting this chance to resume your proper place in the world. Your devoted aunt, Margaret Whitmore. June sank onto her porch steps, the letter trembling in her hands. For 3 years, she had built a life in Cedar Gulch through sheer determination and hard work. She had learned to find contentment in simple pleasures, to take pride in her independence, to appreciate the beauty of the prairie landscape. She had made friends, earned respect, and carved out a place where she belonged. But now, faced with the possibility of returning to the world of books and learning she had lost, she felt the old longing stir in her chest like a physical ache. A teaching position at a respected academy, regular salary, comfortable lodgings, the chance to spend her days discussing Virgil and Ovid with young minds eager to learn. No more worrying about cattle prices or fence repairs, or whether her small vegetable garden would produce enough to see her through the winter. And yet, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her troubled thoughts. This time it was Bo, riding up to her house with the easy grace that marked him as a man completely at home in the saddle. He dismounted and tipped his hat with the courtly manners that never failed to charm her. But his expression shifted to concern when he saw her face. "June, what's wrong?" She held up the letter wordlessly, and he took it with the careful attention of a man who understood that paper sometimes carried the power to change lives. Bo read in silence, his expression growing thoughtful. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. "This is quite an opportunity," he said finally. June searched his face for any sign of what he was truly thinking. "Yes, it is. Teaching at a prestigious academy in Boston. That's everything you trained for, everything your father prepared you to do." "I suppose it is." June's voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and uncertain. Bo settled beside her on the porch steps, his presence solid and comforting. "Tell me what you're thinking." June stared out at the prairie landscape that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "I'm thinking that 3 years ago, I would have given anything for a letter like this. The chance to return to my proper sphere, to use my education in the way it was intended to be used. And now? Now, I'm not sure what my proper sphere is anymore." June turned to look at him, noting the careful neutrality of his expression. "What do you think I should do?" "That's not for me to decide, June. This is your life, your choice. But you must have an opinion." Bo was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the same landscape she'd been contemplating. "I think," he said slowly, "that you should do whatever will make you happiest in the long run. Not what's expected, not what's safe or respectable or convenient. What will let you look back in 20 years without regret? That's not very helpful advice. Maybe not, but it's honest advice." Bo turned to study her face. "What does your heart tell you?" June felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "My heart is confused. Part of me longs for the intellectual stimulation, the sense of purpose that comes from teaching. Part of me dreads the thought of leaving this place, these people. You." The last word came out as barely a whisper, but Bo heard it. His hand found hers, large and warm and steadying. "June," he said gently, "if you stayed here because of me and then someday came to resent the choice, I couldn't bear that. And if I left because I was afraid to trust my heart and spent the rest of my life wondering what might have been." They sat in silence, hands joined, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Bo spoke again. "How long do you have to decide?" "The end of October. 6 weeks. That's time enough to think it through properly, to consider all the angles." Bo squeezed her hand gently. "Have you thought about visiting your aunt, seeing the academy, making sure the reality matches the promise?" June shook her head. "I can't afford the travel, and besides, if I went back to Boston, I'm not sure I'd have the courage to leave again, even if it meant giving up everything you've built here." "I don't know." June's voice was barely audible. "That's what frightens me most. I don't know." Bo was quiet for several minutes, and June could almost feel him thinking, weighing possibilities and consequences with the same careful deliberation he brought to everything that mattered. "What if," he said finally, "we spent the next few weeks exploring what staying might look like? Really exploring it, I mean. Not just continuing as we have been, but considering all the possibilities." "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you could teach here? What if you could use your education in Cedar Gulch? There are children in this valley who would benefit from proper instruction, families who would pay for their sons and daughters to learn more than the basics." June felt a flutter of hope, followed immediately by practical concerns. "Bo, that's a lovely thought. But nothing. Martha Calloway has been talking for months about the need for a proper school teacher. Doc Henley's been trying to interest someone in starting evening classes for the adults who never learned to read properly. Sheriff Rawlings has 3 children who are bright as pennies, but getting no education beyond what their mother can provide. You're talking about starting a school. That would require funding, a building, community support, all of which could be arranged if there was someone qualified and willing to take on the task." Bo turned to face her fully. "June, you could build something here that would matter, something that would last. You could teach children who have never had the opportunity to learn Latin or literature or philosophy. You could open minds that have never been exposed to the wider world of ideas." The possibility he was describing stirred something deep in June's chest. She had been so focused on the choice between staying and leaving that she hadn't considered a third option, staying and creating something new. "It would be a risk," she said slowly. "There's no guarantee the community would support such a venture, no promise that it would succeed. Every worthwhile thing in life is a risk, June. The question is whether it's a risk worth taking." June looked out at the prairie, seeing it now not as a place of exile, but as a landscape of possibilities. Children who could learn to appreciate the beauty of Virgil's poetry. Young minds that could be opened to the wisdom of the ancients. A community that could be enriched by access to learning previously reserved for the wealthy and well-connected. "You would help?" she asked. "With the practical aspects, finding space, building support, managing the business side of things. I would do everything in my power to make it work." Bo's voice carried absolute conviction. "Not because I want to keep you here, though God knows I do, but because I believe you could do something extraordinary in this place." June felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. The safe choice was Boston, returning to a world she knew, taking a position that was guaranteed and respectable. The brave choice was staying and building something from nothing, creating opportunities that had never existed before. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "Of course you do. It's a big decision, and it shouldn't be made lightly." Bo stood and dusted off his pants. "But June, whatever you decide, know that you have my support. If you choose Boston, I'll wish you well and remember our time together with gratitude. If you choose to stay and try something new, I'll be your partner in making it happen." After he left, June sat on her porch until the sun set, reading and rereading her aunt's letter. The elegant script that had once represented everything she'd lost now seemed somehow smaller, less significant against the backdrop of the vast prairie sky. For the first time since the letter had arrived, June began to believe that she might have a real choice to make. Not just between staying and leaving, but between safety and possibility, between returning to what she'd known and creating something entirely new. The decision would not be easy, but at least now she knew it was truly hers to make. The evening light was painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber when Bo arrived at June's ranch, carrying a small wooden box, worn smooth by age and handling. 3 weeks had passed since the arrival of Aunt Margaret's letter, and the weight of decision had been visible in June's face during their daily visits, sometimes hopeful, as they discussed the possibility of establishing a school, sometimes shadowed with doubt about leaving behind the security her aunt's offer represented. June met him at the door, and he could see she had been writing. There was ink on her fingers, and that particular exhaustion that came from wrestling with words and ideas. She invited him to sit with her on the porch, where they could watch the sunset and talk without the constraint of walls. "I've been thinking about what real love looks like," Bo said without preamble, settling beside her on the wooden bench he'd built for her porch the previous week. Not the poet's version or the romantic's dreams, but the kind of love that lasts through hardship and change. June turned to study his face, noting the serious set of his features and the way he held the wooden box as if it contained something precious. "What brought this on?" she asked gently, "watching you struggle with this decision. Seeing how much it matters to you, how much you're torn between two different visions of your future." Bo opened the box carefully, revealing a simple gold ring nestled in faded velvet. "This was my mother's wedding ring. She wore it for 23 years, through good times and lean ones, through sickness and health, through all the changes that life brought to their doorstep." June's breath caught as she looked at the ring. It was plain gold, without ornamentation or precious stones, but it seemed to glow in the evening light with its own inner radiance. "Bo," she whispered. "Let me finish," he said gently. "My parents didn't have much money, didn't travel to exotic places or live in fine houses, but they had something I've never seen, equaled a partnership that made both of them stronger than they could have been alone. My father was a practical man, good with his hands, but not much for book learning. My mother had been a school teacher before they married, educated beyond most women of her time." June could see where this was leading, and her heart began to beat faster. She gave up teaching when they married, as was expected, but she never stopped learning, never stopped growing. And my father, he changed too. Started reading the books she loved, asking questions about the world beyond their farm. They educated each other in ways that went beyond formal schooling. Bo lifted the ring from its velvet nest, holding it so the dying sunlight caught its surface. "When my mother was dying, she took this ring off her finger and pressed it into my hand. She made me promise that when I found a woman who could be my true partner, not just someone to keep house and bear children, but someone who would challenge me and grow with me and make me better than I was alone, I would give it to her with all the love and commitment it represents." June felt tears gathering in her eyes. "Bo, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything yet. I'm not asking you to marry me this moment, though Lord knows I want to." Bo's voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I'm asking you to consider what we might build together, here in Cedar Gulch. Not just a school, though that would be wonderful. Not just a marriage, though I believe we could have a partnership as strong as my parents. I'm asking you to consider building a life that honors both your intelligence and your heart." He held out the ring, not demanding an answer, but offering a possibility. "June Delaney, would you consider becoming my wife? Would you consider staying here and creating something new, a school, a family, a future that we design together instead of accepting what others have planned for us?" June took the ring with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of it, not just the gold, but the history and love it represented. It fit her finger as if it had been made for her. "I'm scared," she admitted, "scared of giving up the security my aunt offers, scared of failing if we try to start a school, scared of loving you so much that I lose myself in the process." "Fear is natural," Bo said gently, "but regret lasts longer than fear." June looked down at the ring on her finger, then up at the man who had offered it with such honest love. In his eyes, she saw not possession, but partnership, not a desire to own her, but a wish to grow alongside her. "The school idea," she said slowly, "do you really think it could work?" "I think you could make anything work if you set your mind to it. And I think this community would support you in ways Boston society never would." Bo paused. "But even if the school failed, even if every practical plan we made fell apart, I would still want you to stay. I would still want to spend my life with you." June felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening onto a room filled with sunlight. The fear was still there, but it was balanced now by something stronger, hope and love, and the recognition of a partnership that could weather whatever storms might come. "Ask me again," she said softly. Bo smiled, understanding immediately what she meant. He slipped off the bench and dropped to one knee, taking her left hand in both of his. "June Delaney," he said, his voice carrying across the prairie evening like a prayer, "will you marry me? Will you be my partner in love and life, and whatever adventures await us? Will you help me build something beautiful in this place we both love?" "Yes," June said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes to all of it. Yes to marriage and partnership and building something new together. Yes to staying here and creating our own future instead of accepting the ones others have planned for us." Bo rose and gathered her into his arms, and their kiss tasted of promise and possibility and the kind of love that could transform two people into something greater than the sum of their parts. When they broke apart, June was smiling through her tears. "I have a letter to write," she said, "to inform my aunt that I will not be accepting her generous offer." "Any regrets?" Bo asked, searching her face for any shadow of doubt. June looked out at the prairie landscape that had become her home, at the man who had become her future, at the ring that symbolized a love built on mutual respect and shared dreams. "None," she said with absolute certainty. "Not a single one." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they sat together on the porch and made plans for their wedding, for the school they would build, for the life they would share. The future stretched out before them like the prairie itself, vast, beautiful, and full of endless possibilities. The stranger arrived in Cedar Gulch on the morning train, a well-dressed man in an expensive suit who asked too many questions and paid too much attention to the answers. Martha Calloway noticed him first, watching from behind the bar as he nursed a whiskey and inquired about recent arrivals to the area, particularly any single women who might have come from back east. By afternoon, word had reached Bo at his ranch. Sheriff Rawlings rode out personally, his expression grim and his usual easy manner replaced by the cautious alertness of a lawman sensing trouble. "Bo," Tom said without preamble, "we need to talk about June." Something cold settled in Bo's stomach. "What about June?" Fellow came in on the morning train. Says he's a private investigator, hired to locate a missing woman. Describes June down to the color of her eyes, though he's calling her by a different name. Tom's hand rested unconsciously on his gun belt. Says she's wanted back east on some legal matter. Bo felt the blood drain from his face. "What kind of legal matter?" "That's what worries me. He's being cagey about the details, but he's got papers that look official enough. claims she's engaged to some wealthy businessman in Boston and ran away from her legal obligations. That's impossible, Bo said immediately. June was never engaged. Her father died, she lost everything to creditors, and she came west to start over. She told me the whole story. Tom's expression was sympathetic but troubled. Bo, I believe June's a good woman, but this fellow name's Coleman, he's got documentation. Birth certificates, academic records, even what looks like a signed engagement contract. The world seemed to tilt around Bo. Where is he now? At the hotel, going through his papers and preparing to make his case formal-like. He says he'll have local law enforcement assistance in bringing her back to Boston to face her obligations. Bo was already moving toward his horse. I need to warn June. Bo, wait. Tom's voice carried the authority of his badge. If this man has legitimate legal standing, interfering could make you an accessory to whatever crime he claims she's committed. I don't care about his papers or his legal standing. June is not going anywhere with a stranger, not if I can prevent it. Bo rode hard to June's ranch, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. By the time he reached her house, he had worked himself into a state of barely controlled panic. June was in her garden, tending to the late-season vegetables that would see her through the early winter. She looked up at the sound of his approach, and her smile faded immediately when she saw his expression. Bo, what's wrong? He dismounted and went to her, taking her hands in his and feeling them tremble when she saw the fear in his eyes. June, I need you to tell me the truth about your past. All of it, no matter how painful or complicated. June's face went pale. What's happened? There's a man in town, a private investigator named Coleman. He says he's looking for a missing woman, and his description matches you exactly. He claims you're engaged to someone in Boston, and that you ran away from legal obligations. June's legs seemed to give out, and she sank onto the garden bench Bo had built for her the previous month. Her face was white as parchment, and her hands shook as she covered it. Oh God, she whispered. He found me. Bo felt his heart stop. June? What aren't you telling me? June was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with a pain so deep it took his breath away. I wasn't entirely truthful about why I came west, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just my father's death and the creditors. There was a man named Harrison Blackwood. Bo knelt beside the bench, his hands still holding hers. Tell me. After my father died, when the debts became overwhelming, Mr. Blackwood approached me with a proposition. He was wealthy, influential, in need of a wife with proper breeding and education to enhance his social standing. In return for marriage, he would pay off my father's debts and provide for me in the style to which I had been accustomed. You were engaged to him? I signed papers, June admitted, her voice thick with shame. I was desperate, frightened, alone. The lawyers made it sound like a reasonable business arrangement, my social position and education in exchange for financial security. Bo felt sick. What changed? I discovered what kind of man he truly was. June's voice grew stronger, anger replacing some of the fear. Controlling, cruel, he expected complete submission, absolute obedience. When I tried to express any opinion of my own, any independence of thought, he would... She stopped, unable to continue. He hurt you. He made it clear that once we were married, I would be his property in every sense of the word. That my education, my interests, my thoughts and feelings were irrelevant to his vision of what his wife should be. June met Bo's eyes. The night before the wedding, I gathered what I could carry and ran. I've been hiding ever since. Bo felt rage building in his chest like a physical force. The engagement papers, they're not legally binding. You can't be forced to marry someone against your will. You don't understand the world I came from, Bo. Men like Harrison Blackwood don't accept defiance. They use their money and influence to get what they want, regardless of law or morality. June's voice was filled with bitter experience. If Coleman is here, it means Blackwood has found me, and he won't leave empty-handed. Then we'll fight him. We'll get a lawyer, challenge his claims. With what money? What influence? Bo, you don't know what you're up against. Blackwood owns judges, politicians, newspapers. In his world, I'm just a hysterical woman who needs to be brought to heel. Bo stood and began pacing, his mind working furiously. There has to be something we can do, some legal protection. There is one thing, June said quietly. Bo stopped pacing and looked at her. If I were married to someone else, the engagement contract would be void. A woman can't be bound to two men simultaneously, even in Blackwood's twisted version of the law. Understanding dawned on Bo's face. You want to marry me? Now. Today. It's not fair to you, June said quickly. You didn't sign up for this kind of trouble. You could walk away, let Coleman take me back to Boston, and avoid any legal complications. Bo silenced her with a kiss that was fierce and desperate and full of absolute determination. June Delaney, he said against her lips, if you think I'm going to let some Eastern dandy drag you away from the life we're building together, you don't know me at all. It won't be easy. Blackwood won't give up. There could be legal battles, investigations. Then we'll face them together, as husband and wife, with all the legal protections that provides. Bo cupped her face in his hands. But first, we need to get to town and find someone to perform a ceremony before Coleman makes his move official. June nodded, her fear transforming into determination. There's a traveling preacher who comes through monthly. He might still be at the church. As they hurried to prepare for the ride to town, Bo felt the weight of the challenge ahead of them. But he also felt something stronger, the absolute certainty that he would not let June be taken from him, not by legal papers or private investigators or wealthy men who thought they could buy and sell human lives. The battle for June's freedom was about to begin, and Bo intended to win it. The Cedar Gulch courthouse was a modest building that rarely saw drama beyond disputes over cattle boundaries and the occasional drunk and disorderly case. But on this grey October morning, it felt like the center of the universe, as the town's entire population seemed to have found reasons to loiter nearby, drawn by the promise of confrontation between their own June McClain and the well-dressed stranger who had arrived with legal papers and Eastern arrogance. Bo stood beside his wife of 12 hours, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder as they waited for Sheriff Rawlings to finish examining the documents Coleman had presented. June wore her best dress, the same one she'd married him in the night before, and her chin was raised with a dignity that made Bo's chest swell with pride. The emergency wedding had been conducted by Reverend Matthews in the small church, witnessed by Martha Calloway, Doc Henley, and half the town's population who had somehow gotten word of the crisis. It had been quick and practical rather than romantic, but when June had spoken her vows in clear, strong Latin, in bonis malisque, in spe metusque, tua siro, Bo had felt his heart nearly burst with love and admiration. Now, as they faced the challenge that had necessitated the hasty ceremony, Bo drew strength from the memory of those words. In good times and bad, in hope and fear, I will be yours. Coleman sat across from them at the courthouse table, his expensive suit and polished shoes marking him as thoroughly out of place in the frontier setting. He was a thin, sharp-featured man with the calculating eyes of someone accustomed to using others' desperation against them. Beside him lay a leather portfolio stuffed with official-looking documents. "Sheriff," Coleman said with barely concealed impatience, "I've shown you Miss Delaney's birth certificate, her academic records, and most importantly, the signed engagement contract between her and my client, Mr. Harrison Blackwood of Boston. The law is quite clear on this matter. The law," Sheriff Rawlings said slowly, "is also quite clear on the matter of marriage. And according to the certificate Reverend Matthews filed this morning, this young lady is now Mrs. Boaz McClain, legally wed in the territory of Wyoming." Coleman's mouth tightened. A marriage of convenience, clearly entered into to avoid legitimate legal obligations. Mr. Blackwood has invested considerable time and money in his engagement to Miss Delaney, including the payment of her father's debts. She cannot simply run away and marry the first cowboy she encounters to escape her responsibilities. Bo felt his temper flare, but June's quiet hand on his arm kept him seated. She had insisted they handle this confrontation with dignity and legal precision rather than frontier justice, and he was determined to honor her wishes. "Mr. Coleman," June said, her voice steady and clear, "I did not marry Mr. McClain to avoid any legal obligations. I married him because I love him and because we have chosen to build a life together." "Love," Coleman scoffed, "a romantic notion that hardly supersedes a legal contract." Doc Henley, who had been invited to observe the proceedings as one of the town's most respected citizens, leaned forward. "Mr. Coleman, I've known Mrs. McClain for nearly 3 years. I've watched her build a life here through honest work and determination. The idea that she would enter into marriage lightly or for convenience is insulting to everyone who knows her character." "Character," Coleman repeated with a thin smile. "Is it character to flee from legal obligations? To abandon an engagement that was entered into willingly and with full understanding of the terms?" June's cheeks colored, but her voice remained steady. "I fled from a situation that had become intolerable." Mr. Blackwood's idea of marriage was not partnership, but ownership. Mr. Blackwood is a gentleman of impeccable reputation and considerable standing in Boston society. His expectations regarding marriage are perfectly conventional. "His expectations," June said quietly, "included the right to dictate my every thought, word, and action. When I expressed any independence of mind, he made it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated in his wife." Coleman waved dismissively. "A woman's place in marriage has been established by centuries of law and tradition. Mr. Blackwood simply expected appropriate feminine submission from his intended bride." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Bo felt every muscle in his body tense with the effort of remaining seated. Martha Calloway, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "Mr. Coleman, I've been married for 37 years. I can tell you that any man who expects submission instead of partnership doesn't deserve a wife. He deserves a trained dog." Several men in the room chuckled, and Coleman's face reddened. "Mrs. Calloway, I hardly think frontier customs are relevant to this legal matter." "Frontier customs," Sheriff Rawlings said dryly, "include the novel idea that a woman has the right to choose her own husband, and Mrs. McClain has made her choice clear." Coleman opened his portfolio and withdrew another document. "Then perhaps this will clarify the situation. This is a territorial court order, properly filed and witnessed, demanding the return of Miss June Delaney to Boston to face charges of breach of contract and theft." "Theft?" Bo's voice was dangerously quiet. "Mr. Blackwood provided considerable funds for Miss Delaney's trousseau and wedding preparations. When she fled, she took property that rightfully belonged to him." June paled. "I took only personal belongings, clothes, a few books, my father's medal, including jewelry and other valuable items that were gifts intended for Mr. Blackwood's intended bride." Coleman's smile was coldly triumphant. "The total value exceeds the threshold for grand larceny under Massachusetts law." Bo saw June's hands tremble and felt his own rage building like a forest fire. This man was twisting the truth, using legal technicalities to terrorize a woman who had done nothing but escape from an intolerable situation. Sheriff Rawlings examined the court order with the careful attention of a man who understood that his next words might determine June's fate. Finally, he looked up. "This is a Massachusetts court order, Mr. Coleman. It has no legal standing in Wyoming territory. It will when I present it to the territorial judge in Cheyenne, which I intend to do tomorrow." "Oh!" The room fell silent. Everyone present understood the implication. If Coleman could get a territorial judge to honor the Massachusetts court order, June would be extradited back to Boston regardless of her marriage to Bo. June stood slowly, her dignity intact despite the fear Bo could see in her eyes. "Mr. Coleman, if I may ask, what does Mr. Blackwood truly hope to gain from all this? Surely he doesn't still wish to marry a woman who clearly wants nothing to do with him." Coleman's expression grew colder. Mr. Blackwood believes in honoring contracts and obligations. When you fled, you publicly humiliated him in front of Boston society. He intends to see that such behavior has consequences. So, this isn't about marriage or love or even money, June said quietly. It's about revenge. It's about justice, Coleman corrected, and Mr. Blackwood is prepared to pursue it as far as necessary. Bo stood beside his wife, his presence solid and protective. Then he'll have to go through me first. Mr. McClain, Coleman said with condescending amusement, you're clearly a man of rustic virtues. But this is a legal matter that requires sophisticated understanding of contract law and interstate commerce. I suggest you leave such complexities to those better equipped to handle them. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Bo felt the eyes of every person in the room on him, waiting to see how he would respond to this Eastern dandy's contempt. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, but it carried the authority of a man who had found his purpose. Mr. Coleman, you may think you're dealing with simple frontier folk who can be impressed by fancy papers and big city threats. But you're wrong. Bo looked around the room, seeing nods of agreement and support on every face. This is a community that values character over contracts, loyalty over legal technicalities, and we take care of our own. Coleman's confidence wavered slightly. Are you threatening to interfere with a legal investigation? I'm informing you, Bo said quietly, that June McClain is under the protection of this community. And if you think you can intimidate her into abandoning the life she's built here, you've seriously underestimated the people of Cedar Gulch. Sheriff Rawlings stood, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. Gentlemen, I think this meeting has run its course. Mr. Coleman, you're welcome to pursue whatever legal remedies you feel are appropriate. But Mrs. McClain is a citizen of Wyoming territory now, and she'll be treated with the respect and protection that citizenship provides. Coleman gathered his papers with barely controlled anger. This isn't over. Mr. Blackwood has resources you can't imagine and influence that reaches far beyond Boston. If necessary, he'll bring federal marshals to resolve this matter. Then we'll be ready for them, Bo said simply. As Coleman stormed out of the courthouse, the people of Cedar Gulch gathered around Bo and June with expressions of support and determination. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. 3 days later, Harrison Blackwood arrived in Cedar Gulch like a storm front, moving across the prairie, dark, imposing, and carrying the promise of destruction. He came not by train but by private coach, accompanied by Coleman and 2 men who had the look of hired muscle, dressed in expensive suits. June saw them first from her kitchen window, and the sight of Blackwood's tall, elegant figure stepping down from the coach made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Even at a distance, she could feel the cold magnetism that had once impressed her desperate younger self, the aura of wealth and power that surrounded him like expensive cologne. Bo was repairing fence in the north pasture, and by the time she managed to get word to him, Blackwood had already made his presence known throughout the town. He had taken the finest room at the hotel, sent his men to make inquiries about the Delaney woman, and requested a meeting with Sheriff Rawlings to discuss the resolution of a delicate legal matter. When Bo arrived at their ranch house, he found June standing at the kitchen table with her father's Harvard medal in her hands and a worn leather satchel at her feet. June? His voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the fear beneath the calm. He's here, she said without looking up. Harrison, I saw him arrive. Bo moved to her side and gently took the medal from her trembling fingers. And I remembered why I ran. June's voice was steady, but tears were sliding down her cheeks. He's not just cruel, Bo. He's patient, methodical. He won't make threats or lose his temper or do anything that might make him look bad in front of witnesses. He'll simply present his case with perfect reasonableness and legal precision, and he'll expect everyone to see the logic of his position. What's in the satchel? My father's papers, academic credentials, letters of recommendation, anything that might prove my education and character. June finally looked up at him. I want to face him, Bo. Not as the frightened girl who ran away, but as the woman I've become. Bo felt his heart swell with pride and terror in equal measure. June, you don't have to prove anything to him or anyone else. Yes, I do. June's voice grew stronger. For 3 years, I've been hiding from what he represents, but I'm not that desperate, powerless girl anymore. I have a life here, a community that supports me, a husband who believes in me. She touched his face gently. And I have something he can never understand or defeat, the knowledge that I am worth more than any contract or legal obligation. The summons came that afternoon. Sheriff Rawlings arrived with an official request for June to appear at the courthouse the following morning to answer questions regarding her disputed legal status. The language was formal and polite, but the underlying threat was clear. He's got a territorial judge coming down from Cheyenne, Tom explained grimly. Judge Morrison, who has a reputation for taking a very conservative view of women's legal rights. If Blackwood can convince him that June fled to avoid legitimate contractual obligations, Morrison might well order her return to Massachusetts. June and Bo spent that evening preparing for what might be their final battle. They reviewed every document in June's possession, discussed every aspect of her history with Blackwood, and planned their strategy with the careful attention of generals preparing for war. Remember, Bo said as they finally prepared for bed, you don't owe him explanations or justifications. You owe him nothing at all. I know, June replied, but I want to speak for myself. I want him to hear, from my own lips, exactly why I chose freedom over his version of security. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the prairie seem to stretch on forever. June, dressed in her finest clothes, not the simple ranch dress she usually wore, but a traveling outfit she'd saved from her Boston days. It was elegant without being ostentatious, refined without being pretentious, and it transformed her from a frontier woman into the educated lady she had always been. When they arrived at the courthouse, they found it packed with townspeople who had come to show their support. Martha Calloway had closed the saloon for the morning. Doc Henley sat in the front row with his medical bag, as if preparing for casualties. Even families from the outlying ranches had made the journey to town. Blackwood was already seated at the front of the room, and when June walked in, his pale blue eyes fixed on her with the intensity of a predator sighting prey. He was exactly as she remembered, tall, distinguished, with silver threading his dark hair and the kind of clothes that whispered of wealth and power. But now she could also see what desperation and youth had hidden from her before, the coldness behind his civilized facade, the calculating cruelty that masqueraded as refinement. Judge Morrison was a thin, severe-looking man with the pinched expression of someone who had never encountered a legal technicality he didn't love. He called the proceedings to order with bureaucratic efficiency and invited Coleman to present his case. Coleman stood and launched into what was clearly a well-rehearsed presentation. He described June's engagement to Blackwood as a legitimate business arrangement entered into, with full knowledge of its terms. He detailed her flight from Boston as a breach of contract that had caused his client both financial loss and public humiliation. He presented documents and testimonies that painted her as an unstable woman who had abandoned her responsibilities and fled to the frontier to avoid the consequences of her actions. When he finished, Judge Morrison turned to June with the weary expression of a man who had heard too many stories of feminine hysteria and irresponsibility. The silence that followed June's declaration stretched across the courthouse like a held breath. Then Blackwood rose to his feet, his composure intact, but something dangerous flickering in his pale eyes. "Your Honor," he said in the cultured tones that had once impressed June so greatly, "we have just witnessed a masterful performance, but that's all it was, a performance designed to evoke sympathy and obscure the simple legal facts of this case. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Blackwood, you have the floor." "Thank you, Your Honor. Miss Delaney, I refuse to dignify this frontier marriage by using her assumed name was indeed educated and intelligent when we met. That intelligence, in fact, was one of the qualities that attracted me to her as a suitable wife." Blackwood's voice carried the reasonable tone of a man explaining simple facts to children. "However, intelligence in a woman, while admirable, must be tempered by proper feminine virtues, obedience, discretion, and an understanding of one's place in the natural order." A dangerous rumble ran through the crowd, but Blackwood continued with unshakable confidence. "When I offered Miss Delaney marriage, I was not merely solving her financial difficulties, I was offering her the protection and guidance that a woman of her temperament clearly needed. Left to her own devices, as we can see, she has descended from the refined society she was born to into frontier coarseness and common labor." Bo felt his hands clench into fists, but June's steady presence beside him kept him seated. "The contract she signed was perfectly legal and entirely appropriate," Blackwood continued. "It specified her obligations as my wife, including the proper deference a husband has every right to expect. If she found those expectations burdensome, the solution was discussion and adjustment within the bounds of marriage, not flight and abandonment." Judge Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Blackwood, what exactly are you seeking from this court?" "Simple justice, Your Honor. I seek the return of my intended bride to Boston, where she can fulfill her legal obligations and where this matter can be resolved properly. I also seek recompense for the considerable expenses I incurred in preparation for our wedding, as well as compensation for the damage to my reputation caused by her public abandonment. And if Mrs. McClain refuses to accompany you willingly—" Blackwood's smile was thin and cold. "Then I trust this court will enforce the legal obligations she entered into voluntarily, regardless of her current emotional state." Judge Morrison turned back to June. "Mrs. McClain, do you have anything to add before I render my decision?" June stood again, but this time Bo stood with her. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "Your Honor, there is one more thing this court should know." She reached into her coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "This is my marriage certificate, properly witnessed and legally filed. It bears the seal of this territory and the signature of Reverend Matthews, who is licensed to perform marriages under territorial law." She handed the certificate to Judge Morrison, who examined it carefully. "As you can see, Your Honor, I am legally married to Boaz McClain. Even if Mr. Blackwood's contract were enforceable, which I dispute, it cannot supersede the legal bond of marriage. A woman cannot be bound to two men simultaneously under any interpretation of the law." Coleman jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this marriage was clearly entered into fraudulently for the sole purpose of avoiding legitimate legal obligations." "Can you prove that, Mr. Coleman?" Judge Morrison asked. "The timing alone proves it. She married this man within hours of learning that Mr. Blackwood's representative had arrived in town." June smiled, and for the first time that day, it was a smile of genuine warmth. "Mr. Coleman, the timing proves nothing except that Mr. McClain and I chose to formalize a relationship that had been growing for months. We were already engaged before your arrival. The sudden need for haste was created by Mr. Blackwood's threats, not by any fraudulent intent on our part." She turned to address the courtroom at large, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "Citizens of Cedar Gulch, you have known me for 3 years. You have seen me work, struggle, and build a life here through honest effort. You have witnessed the courtship between Mr. McClain and myself, seen our friendship grow into love, observed our plans for marriage and for building a school in this community." Heads nodded throughout the crowd. Martha Calloway called out, "That's right, honey. We all saw it happening." June continued, "I ask you now, do you believe I married Mr. McClain from desperation and fraud, or from genuine love and commitment?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Voices throughout the courtroom declared their support, their belief in her honesty, their witness to the genuine courtship they had all observed. Judge Morrison called for order, but Bo could see that the judge was impressed by the community's united support for June. Blackwood's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're allowing yourself to be swayed by frontier sentiment instead of legal precedent. I have a signed contract." "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Morrison said sternly, "you will maintain proper decorum in this courtroom." But the damage was done. In that moment of anger, Blackwood had revealed the arrogant contempt that June had tried to describe, the assumption that his will should supersede everyone else's rights simply because he had money and social position. Judge Morrison stood and looked around the packed courtroom. "I've heard enough testimony to reach a decision. This court recognizes the marriage between June Delaney and Boaz McClain as legal and binding under territorial law. Any prior contracts or agreements are thereby rendered null and void." The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore, this court finds no evidence of fraud or criminal intent in Mrs. McClain's actions. A woman has the right to leave an engagement that has become intolerable, and the right to choose her own husband. Mr. Blackwood, your claims are denied." Blackwood's face had gone white with rage. "This is not over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I have resources and influence that extend far beyond this provincial courtroom." "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Morrison replied with judicial authority, "if you continue to harass Mrs. McClain or attempt to interfere with her lawful marriage, you will find yourself facing charges of criminal harassment. This court's decision is final." As the crowd surged forward to congratulate June and Bo, Coleman quickly gathered his papers and hustled Blackwood toward the door. But not before the defeated man turned for one final venomous look at the woman who had dared to defy him. June met his gaze steadily, no longer the frightened girl who had fled Boston in the night. She was Mrs. Boaz McClain now, protected by law and love and the strength of a community that had chosen to stand with her. The battle was won, but Bo could see in Blackwood's eyes that the man's pride would not easily accept defeat. They would need to remain vigilant, but for now, they were free to begin their life together without the shadow of the past hanging over them. June turned to Bo and spoke the words that sealed their victory. "Take me home, husband." And Bo, his heart full of pride and love and hope for the future, did exactly that. 6 months later, the prairie was painted in the fresh green of early spring, and the sound of children's laughter carried across the valley from the newly constructed schoolhouse that stood where the old Hartwell barn had once sheltered Bo and June during their first storm together. The building was modest but sturdy, with large windows that let in the morning light, and a small bell tower that called students to their lessons each day. A hand-carved wooden sign hung above the entrance: Cedar Gulch Academy, B. J. McClain, Proprietors, Latin lessons available. June stood in the schoolroom doorway, watching her dozen students bent over their slate boards as they practiced their Latin declensions. The youngest was 7-year-old Sarah Hendricks, the sheriff's daughter who had shown remarkable aptitude for languages. The oldest was Tom Morrison, a gangly 15-year-old whose parents had initially resisted the idea of fancy learning, but had changed their minds when they saw how the education had improved their son's confidence and prospects. "Magistra McClain," young Sarah called out, using the Latin title June had taught them for teacher. "How do you say, 'I love learning' in Latin?" "Amo dicere," June replied with a smile. "Can you tell me why the verb changes form?" Sarah's face scrunched in concentration. Because Latin verbs change to show who is doing the action." "Exactly right. And what do we call those different forms?" "Conjugations," several voices called out in unison. June felt the familiar warmth that came with watching young minds grasp new concepts. This was what she had been meant to do, not ornament some man's social position, but nurture curiosity and learning in the next generation. The afternoon classes were for adults, and June had been surprised by the enthusiasm they had shown for education. Martha Calloway was learning to read Latin poetry. Doc Henley was studying Greek medical terminology. Even Sheriff Rawlings attended the evening philosophy discussions that had grown out of the regular curriculum. The school had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes, supported not just by tuition, but by the entire community's investment in their children's futures. Families contributed lumber, labor, and supplies. The women of Cedar Gulch had organized fundraising events. Even the territorial government had provided a small grant. Once word of their innovative approach to frontier education had reached Cheyenne. Bo's contributions had been practical but essential. He had overseen the construction, managed the finances, and handled the business aspects that June found tedious. More importantly, he had supported her vision without trying to control or diminish it, becoming her true partner in every sense of the word. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew June's attention to the window. Bo was riding up to the schoolhouse, and even from a distance she could see his excitement about something. "Class dismissed for today," she announced. "Please practice your vocabulary for tomorrow's lesson." The children gathered their materials with the efficient bustle of students eager to enjoy the afternoon sunshine. As they filed out of the building, they greeted Bo with the easy familiarity of young people who had come to regard him as a trusted friend and mentor. "Mrs. McClain," Bo said as he dismounted, his eyes bright with anticipation. "I have news that I think you'll find interesting." June raised an eyebrow. "Good news, I hope?" "The best possible news." Bo pulled a letter from his coat pocket. "This came in today's mail. It's from Harvard University." June's heart skipped. "Harvard? Why would Harvard be writing to us?" "Because," Bo said with a grin, "word of your school has reached some very important people. Professor James Russell Lowell has heard about the classical education program you've established here, and he's so impressed that he's recommending Cedar Gulch Academy as a model for frontier education." June took the letter with trembling hands and read it quickly. Professor Lowell, one of the most respected scholars in America, had indeed written to praise their innovative approach to bringing classical education to the American West. More than that, he was inviting June to present a paper on her methods at the next meeting of the American Educational Association. "Bo," she whispered, "this is extraordinary. Harvard is taking notice of what we've built here." "There's more," Bo said, his smile growing wider. "Professor Lowell has also recommended that the territorial government designate Cedar Gulch Academy as an official normal school, a place to train other teachers in frontier education methods." June felt tears gathering in her eyes. Not tears of sorrow this time, but of joy and triumph and the deep satisfaction that came from seeing a dream realized beyond her wildest hopes. "We did it," she said wonderfully. "We actually did it." "You did it," Bo corrected gently. "You took the vision and made it real. I just provided the practical support." June shook her head. "No, we did it together. The school, the marriage, the life we've built, none of it would have been possible without true partnership." As if summoned by her words, a small group of townspeople appeared on the road leading to the schoolhouse. Martha Calloway led the procession, carrying what appeared to be a cake. Doc Henley followed with his medical bag replaced by a bottle of champagne. Sheriff Rawlings brought his entire family, and behind them came more families, more friends, more members of the community that had embraced June and Bo as their own. "How did they know about the letter?" June asked, in amazement. "Word travels fast in a small town," Bo replied with a laugh. "Besides, Martha has a sixth sense about celebrations that need to happen." As their friends and neighbors gathered around the schoolhouse, June reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years ago, she had been a desperate fugitive, fleeing from a life that had become unbearable. Now she was a respected educator, a beloved community member, and a woman who had found not just love, but purpose. The celebration continued well into the evening, with impromptu speeches, shared memories, and plans for the future. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, June found herself standing with Bo at the edge of the crowd, watching their friends and neighbors enjoy the success they had all helped to create. "Any regrets?" Bo asked softly, echoing the question he had posed on the night of their engagement. June looked around at the schoolhouse they had built, the community they had joined, the life they had created together. She thought of Aunt Margaret's letter, still unanswered in her desk drawer, and Harrison Blackwood's threats, now powerless and forgotten. She considered the path not taken, the safe return to Boston, the prestigious academy position, the conventional life that others had planned for her. Then she looked at her husband, her partner, her greatest supporter and dearest friend, and smiled with complete certainty. "None," she said, just as she had 6 months earlier. "Not a single one." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, a young cowboy approached the group with swagger and confidence. He had clearly been drinking at the celebration, and he spotted June standing slightly apart from the crowd. "Pardon me, Mum," he said with an exaggerated bow, "but I couldn't help noticing that you're about the prettiest schoolmarm in 3 counties. Allow me to impress you with my education." He cleared his throat dramatically. "Veni, vidi, vici." June and Bo exchanged a look of perfect understanding, and both began to laugh, the easy, comfortable laughter of people who had found their place in the world and could afford to be amused by its smaller follies. "Young man," June replied with twinkling eyes, "that's very impressive. But can you tell me what Julius Caesar said when he crossed the Rubicon?" The cowboy's confident expression faltered. No, ma'am. I can't say that I know that one." He said, "Alea iacta est," June replied gently. "The die is cast. It means that sometimes, when we take a bold step forward, we can't go back to where we started. We can only move forward to whatever destiny awaits us." The young cowboy tipped his hat respectfully and wandered away, perhaps a little wiser than he had been moments before. Bo and June remained at the edge of the celebration, hands joined, watching their friends and neighbors celebrate not just their success, but the continuing miracle of community, love, and the courage to build something beautiful in an untamed land. The die had indeed been cast, and the future stretched ahead of them like the prairie itself, vast, beautiful, and full of endless possibilities for those brave enough to seize them.